Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Pharma IQ's Pharma Manufacturing Automation event. I'm delighted that you're still with us here today, and I hope you've enjoyed the discussion so far. So just a couple of reminders that you'll see the Q&A widget there on the left-hand side of your screen. Feel free to drop any questions into our panelists at any point, and I'll get round to asking those questions at the end of our panel discussion. You'll also see a resource center there at the bottom of your screen. Feel free to click and download any of those resources for future use. They're there for you. So without further ado, we're now going to be focusing on adopting technology in the quest for digital transformation. I'm delighted to be joined by Frank Filman, Manufacturing and Supply Operational Excellence Director at Takeda, Dr. Anthony Bucci, Senior Research Engineer at West Pharma, and Brian Curran, who you met earlier, Senior Vice President, Customer Success for Manufacturing Excellence at MasterControl. So without further ado, welcome all of you to the floor. How are you all today?
Good. Thank you. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I want to open with a bit of a teaser about the end game when we say looking at what data can do for us. So I want to kick off looking at that. Just bear with me as I move the slide. So starting with the end in mind. So I want to look at the external value to support potentially smarter data, internal value, capabilities, and going forward. So kicking off, can I start with you, Anthony? Is that okay?
Sure. I mean, when we start with the end in mind, that's every data project has to start from the same place, which is really that. What are you looking to do with it? If the answer is predictive maintenance on equipment, you take a slightly different path than you would if you're trying to drive external customer value, such as product recommendations. But at the end of the day, you start with your goal, and then you have to examine your systems, own that data to know where it's coming from, and then use the appropriate tools to get it at your endpoint. It's not an easy process, but it can be done if you've got the when you have the right people on it.
Mm-hmm. Frank, have you got any thoughts on that at two?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about it, starting with the end in mind, I mean, the question is, first of all, to define what is the end, because the end, as far as digital is concerned, might not be the same for everybody. So for some people, that might be a fully adaptive plant with everything being fully connected when it comes to manufacturing systems, data, input and output. While for some other sites, maybe digital silos or other more not fully mature digital solutions might be sufficient. So I think an important question to ask before you get onto this journey is, what is your desired end state, and what is good enough for you?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's a really good way to look at it. So defining the goal with the end in mind ultimately. So let's start then. Sorry, go on.
No, I just want to say, because it's all a matter of time and costs in the end, so you don't want to over-engineer this, right? Everybody would like to have the all singing, all dancing facility, but do you really need that? I think that's a question you need to ask yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So let's then start at the very start. Going paperless. So Brian, if it's okay, I'm going to come to you first on your thoughts on this, and then we weave that conversation.
Absolutely. So, and the chart really highlights, or is a good segue, because often we know what we want the outputs to be, whether you're developing an application or a production manufacturing process or any process. There's three main elements: input, process, and output. And so what I see in today's manufacturing world predominantly, there's a lot of data. There are a lot of automation, a lot of systems. But for the production process, we know the inputs, and we know the outputs. But because most of the production processes are using paper-based batch records, It's a little bit like a black box in the context that you don't know what's happening inside of that. And it's a real disadvantage because without that data, you're limited in how much data and information you're able to use as an input for your continuous improvement initiatives.
And
so
Anthony,
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, it's all good, Brian. You carry on, and now I'll pop to Anthony after. Well,
I would say let's go ahead and check with Anthony, because I was going to start talking about the next slide, but let's go ahead and stay here.
Anthony, I think you're making a... Sorry, jumping. So I think you're making a really good point there, Brian. You know, if you're still going with these paper batch records, you're sort of kneecapping yourself because you won't have access to a lot of that granular information if you need to backtrack and find out what happened. You know, if you have a deviation you need to adjust, you don't want a small army of people tracking through a cabinet full of papers to find out what happened on that day. You know, you want to be able to pop on your laptop and say, okay, show me everything from the last week. And then you can start from that approach. So I agree. You got to start opening up that box, find out what's inside, and making that information available. You know, it's a theme we're going to come back to frequently, which is kind of owning your information and knowing what's going on there.
And that's an interesting point you mentioned, Anthony, about because ultimately driving that organizational change related to digitization. And is that something at West you focused on to try and shift that potential mindset or change?
So I think you're sort of giving it away a little bit, right? We're going to touch on that in a slide or two, but yeah, you know, we the more we learn about our internal systems, the more we see what's available to us. You know, everybody starts getting excited about it, and they say to themselves, "Hey, look, we can use this information you have access to solve a different problem." And then before you know it, you're just putting all of your information somewhere that everybody can access and letting the magic happen. You know, you're flipping that 80-20 rule so that it's the way that it makes sense.
Frank, have you got any additions to what's been discussed already about that digitalization journey? Frank, I can't hear you.
That's probably because I'm on mute. Sorry for that.
Come back, Frank. Come back.
No, I did not want to distract anybody here, so by coughing or something. But no, no, really not much to add to what the colleagues have said already. Obviously, there are multiple numerous advantages of going through a digitalized system. And, you know, as we've discussed, I guess the question is more, what exactly does that comprise? But certainly the general idea of going digital is, for me, more a question of when, not if.
Okay, then let's look at kind of the most prominent slide. And actually, this came up in your opening remarks anyway, Brian. And there's been some follow-up questions that I've already noted about data. And it does come down to the importance of data. So, Brian, I'll hand over to you. Feel free to segue to the rest of the team on this. But I want to come to you first on the importance of this.
Don't get me started talking about data. We could be on the slide a long time. No, it really is. As we just tying in these comments from the first 5 minutes or so of this session, it's easy to get bogged down, as I mentioned in the opening comments, and enamored with, let's get rid of the paper. We got to get rid of the paper. But if you keep the end in mind, really what you should be focusing on in parallel is the data that's going to be coming out and providing the inputs for the other, as Anthony mentioned, for many other reasons that you don't even know exists yet. The main issue is the data isn't available as much as it should be. So as the title says, it all comes down to the data. And then the rest of this presentation is going to be talking about some things that you can do with the data. But first, we've got to get the data. So,
Anthony.
And I was going to say, segueing to Frank or Anthony, I think Frank also had a ton of information that he wanted to share about this these specific bullets.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you said a few important things already, and maybe I can add there that obviously when it comes to data, is not that data alone. I think I always look at it in a way of these three topics that are listed there on the slides in terms of automation, digital, and data science. So data is one important part of that, and what we do with the data, as you said, Anthony. And then obviously there are the digital tools that we also need to use this data. There's the IT infrastructure in terms of the let's say enablers, and of course there is a automation around that as well. So how does it all go together with automation in manufacturing, such as cobots, robots, business process automation with RPAs, and so on. So I think these are all elements that can be not looked at standalone, that have to be connected. And maybe another important aspect that Anthony briefly touched on already is connectivity. So I think there is quite often, in my experience, it's easy to underestimate what it means to have all the data available, because it requires connectivity of the systems first, and that is already quite a huge task. And from that point of view, a prioritization of your data and your applications or use cases is very essential.
Yeah, I think, Frank, right there, you sort of hit the nail on the head in the best way, right? It's prioritizing the data you need access to, and then making sure you can actually get to it. And that's no small task. You need all of the experts there, right? You need your digital infrastructure guys who are going to help you find that information. And then you need the plant personnel or the engineers who understand what they're even looking for. It takes a small army to find this information that you're looking for. But once you can get to it, I mean, the sky is the limit with what you can do, especially once you make it available in sort of like in a continuous manner. And this was something we realized here at West as well as we were going through our digital journey, and we're still on it. I by no means am going to say we're done. As we go through, as we look at this information, we realize that it's got value everywhere. It has value to us internally to aid our manufacturing efforts. It has value to our customers because it can help our customers pick better products. We can spend less time looking through the catalogs and dealing with recommendations from people, and you can focus more on just getting the information right the first time, so you can do things a little bit faster. And then I like this last bullet point we have on the slide about predictive capabilities and eliminating iterative and repetitive testing, because we always want to get to a point where the math is handling the load, right? You don't want to have to turn around and every time you need a new answer, you have to go into the lab. Right, you want the math plugged into the data you have available so that you can get better predictive analyses, and that you can really minimize the amount of work you have to do in the lab to just really confirming those results. So it's like the data really ties everything together and helps, really helps drive organizational change that way.
One quick comment I would add, just having gone through this, I think all of these comments also highlighted something new to me, and that is the roles that have been created to support this. I didn't realize a few years ago there's a difference between a data scientist and a data engineer and a data architect, and there's a number of additional roles like that. So depending on where you are in your journey, we might be oversimplifying by just saying, oh, you need the data. Frank and Anthony both did a better job of me than in terms of articulating there's a lot of mechanics and organizational change needed to support incorporating, ingesting, and supporting all of this data.
And Brian, just one quick comment on that one. You're right there. Your data scientists, your data engineers, your data architects, and even within those roles, those individuals view their particular role in a different way. Some data scientists view their role as more of a data engineer, data architect, while some data scientists just look at themselves as users of the information. So you have to make sure that the roles are defined and that the individuals understand what they're supposed to be doing in that to facilitate access to your information. That was one I didn't realize. You just sort of assume, okay, your data team is going to get you what you need, and then they push it to the other group. So it's important to make sure you're talking to the right people.
that's right, Anthony. And if I may add here, the roles and the understanding of the roles is important, but also the interfaces, how these roles link together, because otherwise you create quite easily a chicken and egg problem that somebody says, okay, where do you want your new application installed, and then which product do you want it? And then the end user will ask, so tell me, what is the system about? What can I do with it? And they would say, oh, it depends. I don't know what you want to do with it. And then you get into this endless chicken and egg discussion that sometimes goes into the nirvana if these interfaces are not very well designed. So you need to have a strong link between the business case and the technical offerings here, let's call it.
Absolutely, Frank. Very well put.
Okay, I'm going to interject. I'm really sorry. I keep doing that, but I don't want to ruin the flow. But I want to move to asking and getting the audience involved actually with this discussion. So you'll see on your screens there a poll question, and that's asking you about where would you place your company when it comes to digital maturity, manual, digital, connected, intelligent. My predictions on this, I would like to think digital connected. I'm not sure the majority are intelligent. No offense. Do you think I'm wrong on that, or what would you say your predictions are on that, Brian?
It's a really hard question to answer, particularly for the individuals, because there will be islands or silos that are connected and intelligent, and then there will be other parts of the organization that are purely manual. So I think most people will be frustrated with saying, well, do I answer it for the whole company, or do I answer it in the area I work on?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, let's have a look. Okay. Interesting. A complete mix here. So 16% intelligent, 25% manual, and the same for digital, and 33.3% connected. Okay, the highest. Thoughts on that?
Kudos to the users that consider themselves intelligent. I mean, you're ahead of the game at that point. I honestly would have thought we would have been closer to, with digital being the heaviest weight. So I'm pleasantly surprised by the results of the poll.
Yeah, and that leads us into really our next element then. So Brian mentioned the digital islands. I'm going to come over to you, Brian, on that.
Be happy to start this one. As I mentioned, there are most businesses that have automated aspects of their system, whether it's a data historian or a manufacturing execution system. And those systems, rarely is any kind of enterprise software system put in that's not connected. So the poll, when it's asking manual versus connected, those are not well understood definitions, kind of like the data scientist versus the data engineer. And so my hunch is there are still very much pockets where paper, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, paper is the predominant method of doing batch records. But there are pockets where there's an extreme amount of automation. And a lot of that is governed by the type of product that you're producing, whether it's a product that needs to be produced, manufactured 24/7 by 365, or you only need enough supply where that production run runs on one shift or one shift per week, something like that. Other thoughts?
I can speak from our perspective. We have a lot of our systems tied up in digital automation and whatnot, but we also still have some paper batch records that go out just to facilitate use, what's going on the shop floor. But yeah, I mean, I definitely see your point there, Frank, and I can see how the wording on the poll may have been a little ambiguous. But getting to some more nuts and bolts types applications, these digitalization efforts are really impacting your entire business, right? Even these small changes tend to cascade into much larger ones. In our case, we started by looking for just a couple things, but then once everyone realized what we were doing, what we were capable of, what we were plugged into, that rapidly expanded to now being a full suite of tools to help everyone access the information they need and use it. So like this is what happens as you start owning your data, accessing it, and making it available to a larger organization.
And I think we're also dealing with perception. This is what I've seen when interacting with prospects and customers. All of us want to look at that production floor, and it's hard to say we're manual when you see the level of complexity that exists on every production floor. And so we overlook, what I see most people, they overlook the areas where we aren't connected or integrated or digital. So I think it's also a perception thing, especially for the executives that have put millions and millions of dollars into the shop floor automation. But there are still pockets where the data is hidden on paper. And that's an area of investment that needs to be weighed with all of the other areas to improve the overall automation and availability of the data.
Yeah, I mean, maybe one thought I can add here, and in general I agree, but one thought I would like to add here is coming back to what I said at the start. So how digital do you have to be, right? So I agree, of course, in some cases that is really necessary. And if your goal is to be really fully intelligent everywhere, I fully agree, Brian, then that's exactly what you need to do. However, if you maybe have a business where this is not entirely required, and maybe even your plant would not support it. Maybe the investment you have to make would not even have a business case based on the age of your plant, the type of machines you have, the simplicity of the process you have. There might be various reasons why there is no business case for this. There are also, that's why I'm said at the start, maybe it's okay to be in a digital island, because it's not one or nothing or all or nothing. You have also options, for example, to work with paper batch records, using electronic systems to support the analysis of paper batch records, just as a simple example. And there are many other things that do not require a full connectivity, but still allow you to do some sort of digital work on a digital island. So this is also, I think, an important consideration.
That's an interesting point you make there, Frank. I mean, there's still a lot of processes across many companies where, it's a combination of these paper batch records as well as some digital logging of measurements and process data and things like that. So there is this, you do sort of meet this awkwardness where you have some things on paper and you have some things that go right into your digital systems, and that's an interesting transition to be part of right now.
So, Frank, I want to come to you to kick us off, and looking at the benefits that you've achieved with EBR and review by exception here, before I come to Anthony. So I want to discuss that and the journey you've been on.
Yeah, thanks. I guess you're referring to what our pre-discussion, what I mentioned on MES. I mean, obviously, prerequisite is to have some sort of electronic batch record. Doesn't have to be MES necessarily, but some sort of electronic batch record system. And of course, the more connected, the better. But there is, of course, quite a lot you can do that comes, and I think maybe Anthony or Brian mentioned it at the start. Obviously, once you discover one benefit, you will, see that there are a lot of other as a consequence of that. And I think the story about e-batch records with review by exception are a good example. And because you were asking specifically, I want to share that example. So basically, when you have e-batch records, you obviously have the benefit that you have everything digitalized. So especially if you have, in a more complex way, you have connected an MES with a historian, and you have other systems connected, for example, room monitoring system and so on and so on. So you can have really everything you need in your batch record, for your batch record, all information that could come electronic and automatic into the batch record. But even if they don't come fully automated, you could even manually enter them, because the benefit of an electronic batch record is obviously that it allows the operator to make almost no mistake. And so once you have that level, regardless whether fully automated or partially automated, you have essentially a system where human error is almost eliminated, and any deviation would be flagged by the system automatically. And if you, at that stage, you can go to the what we mentioned, system of concept of review by exception, meaning that rather than in the old days of paper batch records, you have to review by your quality department every single batch record for every single line you're writing to make sure it's filled in properly. You know that because there can be no error made due to the digital guidance, you only have to investigate any flags that are shown by the system. And anywhere where you do not have flags by the system, you do not need to check anymore, meaning you can make the release of the batch record a default. And that's why it's called review by exception, because you only review this by exception. And you can imagine this is an additional benefit of electronic batch records, because you do not only have a massive reduction of human error, you also save a quite substantial amount of time of quality review. And yeah, this I think is a very nice story and example how benefits come on top of each other once you start this journey.
Anthony, do you want to mention West's journey and what's been completed so far with this digital transformation?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. First, I just wanted to say, thank you to Frank for the little discussion that he gave. It was a very good discussion. I very much enjoyed that. From West's perspective, our digital journey is ongoing. We've been all in on this for a few years now, and we've made a lot of headway, but we've also run into a lot of challenges. And realistically, as we said a few slides ago, we're starting with the goal in mind, right? We want to connect our data pools to some advanced analytics, AI, machine learning, all these buzzwords we know and love. And even though we hear this on a lot of conferences, webinars, this one included, that it's just a really tough thing to do. There's a lot of software out there that just wants to layer on top of things and give you answers. But if you're not giving the analytics, if you're not giving the software the right information, you're not going to get anything good out of it, which is why I really liked Frank's comment about making sure information was getting into the system properly and automating data acquisition and things like that. You want to make sure that the right information is going into your system. And then also, sometimes more importantly, that you're accessing that information remotely correctly. And if you don't do that, then there's your old adage, which is garbage in, garbage out. So, you have to spend quite a bit of time making sure that you're getting the right information. And in our case, we kind of went back and forth a little bit. We started with we thought we had enough command of our own information where we put some third-party software on top of it and got poor results. So then we had to go back and say to ourselves, okay, we really need to have a better handle on this information because we don't want to find out that every time we use a third-party software that we weren't giving it enough information. We want to make sure you have everything in one spot that you can just say if it needs characteristics X, Y, and Z, they're all there and they can all be plugged into the right software. So we, our journey right now is really owning our information and making sure that it's available on demand when we need it for the right applications. And we've had a lot of success with it, and from both an internal and external perspective. And we'll touch on that in a couple slides.
Thanks, Anthony. So I want to move on to a really important element that's cropped up a couple of times today, and that's breaking down those internal silos. And so just want to pose that question to the audience first. When you need data and information, do you gather it from disparate systems, request it from other departments, have digital access to everything you need, or a combination of all of the above? Just interested to get an understanding from the audience. Brian, what are your thoughts on the potential answer for this?
Well, the knee-jerk reaction, as I look at standardized test approach, is I would say it's going to be multiple, combination of the above. However, the third one kind of is mutually exclusive to that. because I don't think anybody is going to say have digital access to everything you need. Therefore, most people will select number 1 and number 2.
Awesome. Okay. Okay,
Oh.
interesting. Not
That's
as
amazing.
predicted. Not as predicted. Anthony, yeah, it's amazing. Anthony, I'm going to come to you actually to reflect on these poll results, which will lead us nicely into the next slide.
Yeah, first of all, for the roughly 29% of attendees who said they have access to everything they need, awesome, great work. You know, we're jealous of you because you're probably in the minority of people across the world that can do that. I would suspect that most of us are falling into that category A or B, where we're getting it from different systems and requesting it from other departments. And that's really because of that topic that Ree showed at the start of this portion of the slide deck, which is your data is siloed, right? Different groups control different parts of our data. And for companies that are large global companies that have merged and acquired smaller ones over the years, that's especially true. You know, this is why R&D and data science and all those other groups spend so much of their time locating and tracking down data to use, and then figuring out whether or not it's good enough and iterating until they find what they need. You know, that 80-20 rule is just so vastly inefficient. We need to flip that. And kind of leads me to my next point about, you know, digitalization and harmonized data infrastructure is one of the solutions here, because once you break down those walls, once you put everything in a place where you can access it and begin using it, there's no limit to what you can do with that information. Yeah. Frank or Brian, you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree with what you said, and I would, you know, also from looking at the poll, I would say if you I would just assume that people were speaking from their current perspective and their department they are in with the current task or current, let me say, field of work they are dealing with. I would say overall, probably for most companies, I could not imagine that we are there. For most bigger companies, at least, not because it's just a sheer amount of investment and resources that would need to do this for a major corporation in the top 20 would already define the speed of this, and I think it would be almost impossible to be there in every single department everywhere. So that was, but this is just my assumption that people were probably referring to the field they are working in at present. And the other thing, as you just said, Anthony, I think you made a good point. Even if we feel maybe at this stage that we have already a lot or pretty much all what we currently need, that's certainly not the limit, because there is probably more and more things to be discovered, what you can do, and more things to come with, because this is, I mean, what we're discussing here, you know, I think in 3 months is already outdated, right? Because this field is moving so fast. So from that point of view, there is always new things to discover and new things to learn.
Yeah. And
so Andy, I'm just going to come. Oh, sorry, I keep doing this. I keep interjecting. Brian, over to you.
Thanks. On this one, I wanted to add just a use case, and that is one that I commonly see is something simple. Anthony, the way he talks about data and architecture is like, I want to get our team of data scientists together with Anthony, and we'll collaborate. But there are some more simple use cases associated with that just being digital, such as when the FDA inspector comes in and asks to produce the device history record or the batch record that was created 3 years ago for product XYZ to substantiate that operator John Doe actually had completed training requirements to perform work instruction, blah, blah, blah. Those are the types of things that, yes, we want to get the data, but in simple cases, if we've digitized that, then it's just like a Google search in whatever software system. If you haven't digitized it, that means you've got to go back through banker's boxes to find the batch record from 3 years ago and hope that 3 years ago we actually collected enough data to prove that operators had completed their training. So I think there's a lot of human nature, human tendency is to say, yeah, I have all the data I need because I'm doing my job, so I don't need more data. But then there are specific use cases when we start examining more closely, can you search on a device history or batch record that was produced 3 years ago? Most companies are not in a position to do that across all their lines.
And that's actually a really great point, Brian. And it also kind of speaks to the different perspectives each of us are coming from in this panel, right? I'm speaking very much from a perspective of, there's already a system in place. It's a matter of locating what I need and trying to use it for various purposes. You're approaching it from getting the information into the system standpoint. And Frank is focusing on more of a very practical standpoint of, okay, well, how can I connect all of my stuff together at a plant level to really drive change? So it's really interesting to see how we're all approaching this, and it all keeps coming back to a lot of these same topics.
Agreed.
Anthony, I'm going to come to you to look at accessibility for all, looking at information, looking at trying to bring that all together in a harmonized approach. So I'll hand over to you on that.
So if we could skip ahead to 2 slides to the little cartoon, that's a really good place for me to start talking about that.
Yeah, that should be there now. Can you see that one?
Yes, this is the slide I was talking about.
Perfect.
So when we've been talking about trying to get at our own information internally and trying to make it accessible, what we very quickly realized was, there were a lot of places to look for it. And each one of these locations had an admin, each one of these required a separate login, each one of these had a separate architecture, and you can see how this snowballs into a huge project. So I could say without any hesitancy, I spent over a year just trying to locate the systems that I needed to get into, and then find the information that I needed within it. And then, of course, you run into your typical data issues. If I was going into silo A and silo D and they had the same information, well, I hate to break it to you, but there were 4 or 5 different labels for what I was looking for. It could have been characteristic X in silo A, and in silo D it was referred to as char X. These sorts of issues popped up all over the place. So as you're going through it, as you're trying to find the information you need to drive change, to drive analytics, you're constantly having to iterate and say, okay, where are the characteristics that I need? How do I put them in a harmonized data structure so that I can actually use them and get useful information out of it? It really is no small task, and it's incredibly difficult, even with a lot of the tools we currently have available. We had several teams helping me get to this point. But once you have everything funneled into this really nice little kind of data warehouse, even if it's just for a small portion of that information, you'll be amazed at what you can plug into it and get from this information. From our perspective, we saw value everywhere. We saw value both for our internal systems, things like, okay, can we track characteristics from different plants across different time frames? Yeah, you can start to do that once you have access to your information. But more importantly, we also said to ourselves, well, there's a set of calculations we perform when we talk to customers. Could we tie that into some of this data? The answer to that was yes as well. So what we did was we started building this common utility where you can tie up a lot of this math and really help people get at things much faster, much more efficiently, so that you can make better decisions. So that's just a little bit about the journey we've been on.
So Frank, I just want to come back to you, if that's okay, and apologies if I've missed this, but I want to look at the challenges to accessing data in a little bit more detail. And that's from, say, skills within the workforce, infrastructure. Are there any additional points you want to touch on that, Frank?
Yeah, sure. There are definitely a few I'd like to touch on. I mean, maybe we start with the first one, as it's shown on the slide, the IT infrastructure. I think this is something that is quite often underestimated, the amount of investment, and giving that there are in every company limited resources internally, because it's not just a matter of getting contractors in from external. You also need to have, of course, the internal experts to support this. Is just tremendous, and so this is something that should not be underestimated, and is not, you come up with a budget for next year and you will have it all by the end of the year. That's usually not the case, because especially if you want to go to the really complex system, to the full connectivity, to do all the data predictions and everything you can really do, that is a long way. So that is something in my experience that is generally in the industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, underestimated. That links very much to the contextualization of data. So I think we mentioned that already several times. Also, my colleagues mentioned that obviously this is essential because you cannot expect any complex data analytics if you do not have contextualized data. Another two also quite important topics we have not touched on so much is the digital skills and this process standardization. So maybe starting with the latter one, process standardization. I mean, I'm an operational excellence person, so I'm dealing a lot with process standardization, and that is actually the way I came into digital, because it is an essential prerequisite. And I think, Anthony, you said it, garbage in, garbage out, right? So basically, processes do not get better when we digitalize them. They only get better when we streamline them before, so we can properly digitalize them. And that's actually where project standardization comes in, and that is a prerequisite, a pre-work that has to be done. Otherwise, you will not have the quality of digital processes that you are expecting. And last but not least, as I mentioned, I wanted to touch on the digital skills of the workforce. Because again, in the pharmaceutical industry, there's sometimes just funny ideas that you take some people from university and you have all your problems solved. But of course, these guys have a lot of knowledge and a lot of good ideas, but they don't have the experience of your process. So you still need to train the guy that runs this process since 20 years on the shop floor. And you need probably also people in between that have on one way have a good experience, but in another way also good digital knowledge. And you need to bring all these different levels of knowledge together and train really and think carefully in terms of the competencies that you require in the different roles with respect to digital and data science skills. So that's, again, something that is sometimes underestimated, and this, for me, a very important cornerstone of the whole digitalization piece. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything here.
I think that's well put, Frank. And I really liked what you were touching on there with the process standardization as the prerequisite. You want to make sure you're getting the same information out of your process every time. But just to kind of expand on that point a little bit, you want to make sure that it's not just for that process in one specific plant. You want to make sure that it's for all of your facilities, right? If each facility refers to something a little bit differently, it becomes much more difficult to locate that information internally and use it. So it's it's important to standardize not just at the plant level, but also the organizational level. Brian, you look like you're getting ready to say something.
Oh, no. No, I was trying to figure out whether to say something now or something later going into, I'm not sure where we are on time. I will add one thing since I've started talking, and that is the challenge that Anthony mentioned about labels, different labels across different sites. It's really an organizational change problem, because those labels are usually associated with different people and different executives. And so you can't just change the labels to all be consistent to the one that you think is the right one. You've got to lobby across multiple sites, multiple levels of organization to come up with the single source of truth of what we're going to call this label. Kind of in old school technology terms, you have to create your data dictionary, and you have to create that in a way that all your executives agree, this is what revenue means, and this is how we're going to show that, or whatever field you're managing throughout the process.
And actually, Brian, I want to come to you about the power of data, but not just the power of data, actually being able to access the right data and how critical and important that is.
So I love using analogies, and in this instance, I'll use this movie. Started out as a book called Moneyball, and it's all about the premise of how Billy Beane, played by Brad Pitt, was the general manager of the Oakland A's. And years ago, Oakland A's had a budget that was about that small, and the Yankees had a big budget, and the Red Sox had a big budget. how was he going to compete? He didn't have the dollars. And so he came up with a way of leveraging data. Since then, all Major League Baseball teams, basketball teams, you'll see it in the stats that we see after games in terms of the variety of stats that are being tracked, but it is much more about leveraging the data that you have. And in this case of Moneyball, he was able to find the right combination of people to perform specific jobs. And they went on, it was a huge competitive advantage. Yes, it was a movie, but it was based on a real life situation where the Oakland A's went into a series of winning way more games than they should have been based on their budget that was available. So I think if you find the right data and leverage it in the right way, no matter what size company you are, you have the potential to follow in the footsteps, if you will, of the Oakland A's and Billy Beane, and leverage it as a competitive advantage to win more often than you probably should be. So that's just the lead in, and to tie in with what Frank and Anthony have been highlighting, my emphasis is finding those areas where there's paper and doing more to get that as an input. So in the cartoon diagram, sites A through site F, well, maybe we're using manual batch records and it's going to be additive data to the data that already exists coming from data historians and whatnot. But regardless, there's other benefits also to digitizing and looking at the slide that's presented right now, and that's focusing on augmenting workers. To Frank's point, it doesn't make business sense to fully automate every production line. Based on volume or level of difficulty, there's a number of factors where it might not just make business sense, which means more often than not, pharma manufacturing lines are going to have more workers out there. And so for me, going digital also allows us to augment those workers as well as giving us the data. Anthony and Frank, comments on this slide?
All right. I really like this slide. It's hitting on a lot of really great points when you're trying to automate, when you're trying to make things much more digital. And then one of the points that I really like is this first one about automation of time-intensive and low-reward tasks. If you're an operator on the floor and every time you take a measurement, you have to key it into the computer manually, that is the definition of a time-intensive, low-reward task, right? You really want to be moving towards eliminating that step in the process and having the data go straight from the machine to your quality system, which frees up the worker's time to, maybe identify if there's an issue on the line or something along those lines, which is exactly the second bullet point there, right? And instead of focusing on writing down a number, the employee can focus on the process and making sure that's working well.
Yeah. I absolutely fully agree, Anthony. And maybe to add this, I think this is a great thing, obviously, that you can shift your people, your employees from really purely doing physical work to monitor a process, to even maybe remotely monitor a process in some cases. I think there's some efficiency gains to be made because I can obviously monitor several processes at the same time from a control room, ideally, so that would even allow to have less people engaged in certain activities and be used in other areas. I think it also brings a challenge that we are facing already in some parts of the world as a global company, because especially in very competitive markets, it gets harder and harder to find these people. While maybe 10 years ago, you could still, have people with relatively simple education, simple skills on the shop floor for relatively simple machines. These machines get more complex. There's a higher amount of digitalization and automation involved, and therefore you need to train these people. And also it's harder, of course, if you need new people or additional people, let's say, to find these skill sets. So it's it's absolutely essential, coming back to the point I made before, that your company, your digitalization with the right level of capability building, because you will not be able to find all these people in the market, at least not in some parts of the world. And from that point of view, this is a very important aspect.
Anthony, I'm just going to come back to you. We've got a nice graph here that you've given, and that's on data-driven business decisions. So I just want to cover off how data allows for the automation support of time-intensive but more low-reward tasks, freeing up those people to move on to the higher value work. So I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, so I'm actually very proud of this, the graphic on this slide. You know, it's the result of a lot of hard work getting into our information systems and really sussing out the information that's going to be most impactful to both our internal customers and our external customers. And really what it's coming down to is, you know, we're getting to a point where we've made enough of our information readily available where it can be explored. And not only can it be explored, but it can be combined with other products, whether or not they're ours. And our application will actually perform the math on it, right? It'll take West components, it'll take non-West components, and it'll tell you what, you know, some of these basic calculations will anticipate based on the information that's been loaded into the system. And really what this allows us to do from an internal perspective is it frees up some of our more technical staff from doing these calculations by hand and making judgment calls, and allows them to tackle much more complex questions. So, you know, there's a lot of power, there's a lot of information tied up in this one screenshot, and I could probably spend the next 2 hours talking about it if I had the time, but I don't have that kind of time today.
Brian, have you got anything to add to this slide at all?
You bet. Yeah, one example that we've seen in our customers leveraging the data is, I think it was mentioned earlier in this session about planned deviations and being able to know what deviations have existed before. So in this instance, using data, and I don't think they have a fancy chart like this, but we'll get Anthony to help us to do this. But using that data, if you know you're about ready to do a production run, and in the past, 3 of the 4 planned deviations existed, what impact did that have on your production run time? Maybe negligible. Maybe it extended the time by an hour or 10%, whatever metric you want to use. If it extends the time, it then puts the decision-making capability in the hands of the person to go ahead and adjust resources and maybe pull more resources in. Instead of blindly, if you don't have access to that data and you don't have the recollection to be able to look at all of those variables, what may end up happening is your production run runs over, which then it has a domino effect. You have to pay for expedited shipping after you pay for overtime, and then grievances if your customer delivery is not on time. So little things like being able to leverage the data and the history and being able to present that to somebody in real time can allow them to make one simple change to say, pull more people in. But it alleviates or avoids 4 or 5 different costs that would have been incurred if they hadn't made that one simple change.
Okay. So I'm just conscious never to interrupt you, so I don't want to cut any of you off. So I'm also conscious of time, actually, and that we've got about 5 minutes max before we wrap up our discussion today. So looking at future possibilities with AI and ML, and just covering off what that may look like, and that potentially could be your key takeaway from today's session. So Frank, if it's okay, I'll come to you first on this.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think a lot of that we have discussed already today. I mean, when it comes to analytics, purely thinking about, you know, a lot of things are sold as new these days, but if you think about multivariate data analysis, they're not that new. I think, you know, in terms of the statistical possibilities to optimize processes, but what is new is, of course, that we can do this automated, that we can do it with automated data collection, and also that we can use artificial intelligence to drive the best conclusions from it. So that's certainly, I think, one important aspect. And I would also briefly want to touch on the last point of predictive maintenance. I think that I see as a tremendous opportunity. It gives us a chance to optimize our resources with respect to maintenance. It gives us an opportunity, and this is all based on data, really, on measuring the right data and using the right data and analyzing the data in the right way. It saves resources. It could extend the lifetime of our machines. It could reduce the number of breakdowns. It could even generate additional benefits such as energy savings, carbon dioxide footprint reductions, and many other things you could think of that are related to machine setting optimization, leave alone like business benefits, additional business benefits such as yield increase, and you know, you name it. You can go well beyond that if you combine it then with other data and applications. So I think, you know, from my end, and I think Anthony said it at the start, possibilities are endless. And yeah, I'm really looking forward. And maybe if we sit together again in a year's time, how things have moved forward, and probably a lot of more exciting things to discuss.
Anthony, over to you off the back of that.
I'm trying to be conscious of time myself, because I could talk on this slide for quite some time, right? You know, I just have to say that I agree with everything Frank said. And I just wanted to point out that you reinforce this need to make sure you're giving your analytics, your AI, your ML, you're giving it the right information. You know, you don't want to end up like, I'm not going to name drop any manufacturers or anything here, but you know, there was a good story out in the news a while back where a self-driving car manufacturer, the car manufacturer that was testing out self-driving technology was tricked. I believe it was a piece of duct tape was placed on a stop sign to cause the vehicle to accelerate through the stop sign. You don't want to be that person, right? You want to make sure you're giving your models the right amount of information so that it can handle the cases that it'll encounter appropriately.
Nice. That was very succinct, Anthony. I was expecting you. That was incredibly succinct. So on that note then, just then as a final takeaway from yourself, Brian, before we close this panel, what would you say about this going forward?
I like, again, I'll use an analogy. So almost everyone that's driving a modern car these days is benefiting from a tremendous amount of data that's being monitored, and machine learning is being applied. So I won't go to Anthony's example of the totally self-automated vehicle, but I'll use the other examples that the lane detection, the vehicle tells you as a driver when you're about ready to depart a lane, or the automatic braking that happens faster than I can apply the brake. The system, based on a collision detection, will apply the brakes. That's what we want to do for our production manufacturing systems. We want our data and our machine learning to tell us when we're drifting out of a lane and help us get back into the lane. And if there's an emergency, we want it to somehow do a notification that effectively is applying a brake. That's where I think we will get to. And it's a journey to get there as an individual company. And as we're seeing in the car industry, it's a journey to get there as an entire industry. But over time, more and more of those capabilities will become standard process in the pharma manufacturing world, just like they are in cars.
And I think just retouching on everything that's been discussed, breaking down those internal silos, looking at that internal external collaboration, integration of systems, but actually the key message today is to keep driving forward, whatever barriers you're coming up against, technology isn't going to slow down and wait for us, and therefore we need to be upskilling, we need to be driving the workforce or moving others onto high value tasks, and equally looking at adapting to change. So without further ado, Anthony, Frank, Brian, thank you so much for contributing to the panel today. It's been a pleasure. For our audience, we're now going to move on to our closing remarks from Brian before we close today's conference. But Anthony and Frank, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.
Pleasure.
Take care, take care. So I'm going to come over to you, Brian, and hand over to you just to really close out today's session, which has been a real amalgamation of looking at adoption of technology, bridging the IT-OT gap, looking at the main challenges, organizational, technical capabilities, but ultimately driving change forward. So without further ado, I'm handing over to you to close today.
Great. Thank you for that summary as well. Thank you for all the attendees, to Pharma IQ for allowing us to participate in this. It really is eye-opening. I spend every day thinking about our world and how I view it, but you know, sessions like this help me realize that's just one perspective. So just coming off the session with Anthony and Frank was really illuminating for me. As I look at all these sessions and I think about the challenges and I think about applying some principles that I just mentioned about the car industry, automotive industry, and applying it to pharma manufacturing, it's inspiring. I'm very hopeful. Hopefully you're feeling the same way. Yes, there are daunting challenges, but I wanted to give a parting thought, which I think I've heard in different forms multiple times today. And that is, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And I was thinking about that quote yesterday and realized 1,000 miles, that doesn't seem very long. I'll drive 1,000 miles down to Texas over the summer in just a day or two. But that quote originated 2,500 years ago from Lao Tzu. And 1,000 miles, 2,500 years ago, that's daunting. How am I going to cover that distance? It's way different. So digital transformation, in my opinion, must feel like 1,000 miles, what it felt like 2,500 years ago. Terms and concepts, specialized skills, machine learning, artificial intelligence, predictive analytics, those are really hard things to see. What's easy to see? From my perspective, what's easy to see is what's beneath your feet. And as I learned more about that quote, a journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. The actual translation, or more precise translation, is a journey of 1,000 miles begins with what's beneath your feet. And for me, what's beneath our feet is what's out on the shop floor. And we need to do a better job, I think, of looking for areas that can be improved. Sometimes that's automating particular processes. Sometimes in my world, that's finding out where the paper is and digitizing that paper. Because where the paper is where the human operators are interacting with that paper, which turns into human errors, which turns into all kinds of waste, including review times of weeks or months. Another point, we talked about labor and the operators multiple times today. For most manufacturers, pharma manufacturers, labor is the largest cost, or one of the largest costs. And I'll rephrase that the way I like to say it. It's one of the largest investments. Automating people away just isn't an option in all cases. And so when it's not an option, when it doesn't make good business case, what we should be looking at is augmenting those operators and augmenting the humans and helping them. So diving into a couple of specific examples, one of the customers that we had started digital. There were 3 pharma executives coming from different places in the industry, started a startup in California, and they knew going in that if they went with paper to begin with, it was going to be costly. And so they started with digital and predicted that they would be able to scale their organization with 30% fewer people. And that's panning out. Well, you and I, most of us on this call, all work for existing companies. Some of us might be thinking of creating a new company, and that might be applicable in terms of that stat. But for those of us that already work for companies, here's another example. We had a customer who looked at and realized the paper was causing problems, and so they inspected wherever the operator was interacting with paper. They looked at the work instruction interaction, completing the training, doing verifiers, witnesses, reviews, and actually it turns out there isn't one review because of the human errors that's introduced. It's very common that companies try to address the data quality problem by adding multiple layers of reviews to ensure that the final batch record meets the requirements. So they ended up estimating that 14% of their time could be solved by replacing paper with digital. And the question then is, well, that's 1 hour a day per operator. What's that operator going to do? Well, they could monitor the situation, monitor the performance. They could come up with better things to do, process improvements. As an organization, maybe you have enough operators. That means you could actually add another line, or maybe add another customer to an existing line. There's a lot of things that can be done with those cost savings. But beyond that, there's even additional benefits. Your operators that are out on the pharma manufacturing floor are accustomed to using mini computers that they hold in their hand. It's called a phone. And to throw paper at them, it's a little challenging. So we have had customers say, we are better able to retain operators if we're using digital and we don't force them to use paper. And we've also had other customers that they use that as part of their hiring strategy. Where digital, you don't have to use paper in the manufacturing process. So what's the end game? What's at the end of the proverbial 1,000 miles? At the end, there are some very advanced capabilities, sci-fi, machine learning, artificial intelligence, et cetera. But what's the first step? What's beneath your feet? What can you do today? Digitize a batch record. Just pick one. Not all your batch records. Pick one site. Take the first step and pick a line. With advanced technologies, modern technologies, within 30 to 60 days, you could have your first line move from paper-based batch records to digital batch records. And then you've proven the concept with a very low-risk investment. And so based on that, you're able to learn, iterate, expand. Taking one step at a time, in the not too distant future, you might be able to look back and say how far we've come. But as Ree mentioned and others have mentioned today, the real challenge and the real objective here is to try to get you and all of us to take that first step. We know it's a reality. It's not if, it's just when. And for that, thank you for listening. Really appreciate the opportunity to share my thoughts. And thank you for pulling all of this together, Ree, along with Pharma IQ.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian, for closing and really giving everybody food for thought here. Take that step forward, that small step, and it's a progressive step. And I've really enjoyed the whole of today, really hearing where everybody's at within their journey. Stay tuned. There's more from Pharma IQ coming for the rest of this calendar year online for our digital events. So I look forward to hopefully seeing you at one of our future events. Click into the Pharma IQ network, have a look, see what takes your fancy, and I'll hope to meet you again soon. But for now, Brian, thank you very much. To all of our other speakers and sponsors, thank you. And thank you for closing, Brian, today.
Happy. Thank you. Bye, all.